should you play Starfield? Is it a good game? Yeah, I think so. Overall, I found it to be a particularly enjoyable title, and if you like that Bethesda Game Studios formula, this has all of that as well as a bunch more as one of the company's least buggy releases to date. So now, if you want an extended version of those thoughts, here's my Starfield review. This after around 100 hours with the game, about 60 to 70 of those being actual playtime, while another 20 to 30 were just messing around, limit testing, abusing console commands, or getting up to all kinds of no good. And right off the bat, Bethesda deserves some praise for this one. Review codes went out exactly 2 weeks before this embargo did lift, 2 weeks ago from today, and giving a bunch of media members 2 weeks to do whatever they want with your game is a huge sign of confidence for the company. And I completely understand why they did it. 2 weeks with Starfield is not nearly enough time to make a comprehensive review. I have a feeling a lot of these Starfield reviews that inevitably you're going to be watching today are going to begin by describing what specifically they played, or even describing their impressions rather than a full review, because there simply wasn't enough time to do everything. This game is really that big. But for me, I played Starfield in a very unique way, because I basically played it wrong for most Bethesda games. Not entirely sure why, but for some reason I just beelined the main story and did almost none of the side content until I actually beat the game for the first time. And for better or worse, I can't talk about a lot of that. I received Starfield totally for free thanks to a review code from Bethesda, and the only thing they did ask for this initial content is to not share too much about spoilery topics in the game. And as you can imagine, as you do the main story, there are some incredibly interesting twists and very spoilery turns. So get subscribed, because yes, a spoiler talk on Starfield is coming in the future. Starfield is absolutely a return to form from Bethesda. The game genuinely plays like Skyrim in space, with an insane amount of content, and that is definitely for better or worse. As not everything here is perfect, Starfield is not a 10 out of 10 game for me. In Starfield, you walk through a city and quests are going to be thrown at you left and right. Some of these are one of the several main quest lines in the game. Constellation has the main quest line in Starfield, but each of the major factions has an extended main quest associated with them, and there's of course also a mountain of side quests all throughout. And even outside of just story content, you also have a massive galaxy to explore. Like if you want, from a relatively early point into the game, you could go land on a random planet and start outpost building, and then all of a sudden 20 hours went by and you're still in the depths of outpost building. And this is one of the things that Bethesda did a really good job at with Starfield. After only a little over 1 hour with the game, I had my own spaceship and was able to go off and do pretty much whatever I wanted. There were tons of planets, tons of quests at my disposal, and just personally what I chose to do first was the main story, but I had a plethora of options even from relatively early on. And without giving any spoilers, because I won't be sharing any major story spoilers in this video, the main story is exactly what they described in the lead up. You find this artifact right at the start of the game, and then you go on to join Constellation to look for more artifacts and attempt to find out what they do or what they mean. And that truly is the whole thing. As I was playing, I kind of thought there might be a twist or some other plot line that comes in during Starfield, but that doesn't really happen. The entirety of the main story is really around the artifacts and trying to figure out what they do, which admittedly for me did get a bit tired after a while. Your motivation to play the main story in Starfield is really going to hinge on your curiosity of the unknown. The big answers and the big revelations only come very late into the story, and a lot of the time as you're doing the main story in Starfield, you're really just getting artifacts from various places or different people. Like, believe me, as you play this game, you're going to be doing quite a bit of cave diving. There are some twists and turns along the way that definitely hooked me more during individual quests, but then it quickly goes back to that baseline of just looking for more artifacts and trying to figure out what they do. Each of the Constellation members are going to have their own explanation as to what's going on. Is it magic? Is it God? Or just some great future technology? There's some beautiful and super intense moments during this. Some of the most thought-provoking moments I have ever experienced in a Bethesda game came during the Starfield main story, but then a lot of the gameplay is also just literally looking for things. I think a lot of people will find other aspects of Starfield more enjoyable than the core Constellation story, and I'm definitely one of those people. I had about 23 hours of playtime when I beat Starfield's main story, and after that I dove into some of the faction quest lines, and yeah, in typical Bethesda fashion, these faction quest lines are great. The two big players in the Starfield universe are going to be the Freestar Collective and the United Colonies. Although there's also Ryujin just kind of floating around there. Each of these feature their own main quest lines, and these are basically going to be mini main stories. Each quest line is roughly 10 hours long, dealing with one specific issue. For the United Colonies, there's a new monstrous threat you have to deal with, while for the Freestar Collective, a merc group is causing some trouble. And one of the things Starfield does really well is each of these factions really do have their own identity. As you're doing the United Colonies quest, you're going to be talking in boardrooms, interacting with scientists, and even entering into research labs on various planets. The United Colonies are truly that huge industrial spacer faction, and their questline made it feel that way. But conversely, as you're doing the Freestar quests, you're going to casinos, stopping bank robberies, and even flashing your badge to get answers from a rapscallion. These two questlines give you a really good look at the two sides of the spacer future. And music played a huge role throughout all of this. Each faction has their own soundtrack associated with them, and it does a really good job at establishing the right vibe for their quests.
Late one night, Andy will come to town.
And a really fun part of the faction questlines in Starfield is how many different places they take you. Like, yeah, you're going to spend a decent amount of time in both New Atlantis and Aquila City, and both of these are epic, but each of these factions have a variety of other and sometimes smaller locations as well, and you spend a good amount of time at those also. And beyond this, there was a ton of side stories you would encounter in Starfield. You're not only dealing with main faction questlines. You'll probably get involved with a religion in Starfield because those are super entertaining. And time again, as I was playing the game, the culture Bethesda created just streamed through. You'd go to new places and things would genuinely feel different, from the sounds to how people interacted to even how they treated you and whatever status you may have. Starfield is a galaxy-wide game, and they did a really great job at conveying that through the gameplay and through your interactions with NPCs. Even just down to lots of different accents. While you're playing Starfield, you're going to hear from Americans, Australians, Scots, and way more types of peoples that I couldn't even recognize. But when it comes to choice and consequence during these quests, or even the RPG elements of Starfield overall, depending on where you kept your expectations will largely determine how you feel about quest content in this game. Starfield is truly Fallout 4 or Skyrim in space. Quests in Starfield did not feel significantly deeper, like you had way more secret choices compared to a Fallout 4 quest. Like, even as just one simple example, I continuously tried to do the little quick save before massacring a quest NPC, and the vast majority of the time in Starfield, that NPC was essential and unkillable. And that's not to say you can't take out other NPCs as a way of progressing quests. In fact, there's a lot of times where you could take out somebody else's ship to progress a quest, but a full-on psychopath playthrough would be incredibly difficult. There's only a select few NPCs that seem like they didn't have the essential tag while they were still relevant for a quest. One of the more disappointing examples was once during a quest on Neon, I had to convince a shop owner to help me out. The shop owner happened to give me a side quest where they needed some help with Neon security. I dealt with that problem for them in return for my main quest that was also associated with that character, but even despite the fact that I just did a full-fledged side quest for them, they acted like we had never met before. Now, of course, this is because these are two completely separate quests. My actions on one were not accounted for on the other, but I just kind of hoped there would be something. So if you were hoping for far more quest interactivity or an even unprecedented level of simulation, I don't think you'll really get that or notice that here. Instead, what Starfield's truly bring to the table is a ridiculous amount of content. The quests aren't necessarily far deeper compared to past games, but there are definitely way more of them. You'll be getting pulled away by interesting side stories on a very frequent basis, which I think for a lot of fans will be a win and a huge positive overall. And it was a similar story for the new RPG mechanics with both traits and backgrounds. These new mechanics perfectly met my expectations, but never really exceeded them. The traits I chose were to have parents, get a starter home, and be a United Colonies native. I got a nice house that was totally empty, not even having a bed in it to sleep in. I made a couple of payments on it and then just kind of forgot about it. Crafting is a whole thing in Starfield, I'll talk about that a bit later. So furnishing this house, especially in the early part of the game, is kind of a tall and tedious order. The United Colonies native trait came up a few times during dialogue, mostly being able to say, oh yeah, I know that, I learned about it in my UC Civics class. That line came up several times, although I was likely earning way more money than I typically would during the United Colonies questline. One of the other benefits is getting more credits less as a reward for quests from that trait. But honestly, having this trait didn't give me any dramatically different experiences during the United Colonies questline, just a couple of dialogue options here or there that were largely the same as the other options. And the parents trait definitely was the most fun of the three I chose. You could visit your parents at their apartment, and you're paying for this apartment in New Atlantis, but your parents could also visit you, sometimes visiting you at work. They would show up at Constellation from time to time or even leave you a note, and they would give you some unique items that I assume you could only acquire through your parents, like a high school backpack that increases your carry weight, which is incredibly handy early on when you don't have many ways to increase your carry weight. As well, sometimes you could run into your parents in surprising places. Overall, at least for the three traits I chose, those were one of those things that really just met my expectations for Starfield. I had a couple of good laughs, but it wasn't really a huge impact on gameplay overall. The United Colonies trait in particular was just a bit lackluster to me. I mean, you would think during an entire questline it would come up at least one time with some kind of cool or unique option, although it probably did net me tens of thousands of additional credits. You get a lot of money from doing quests in this game. I mean, even as just a simple example, as I went to write my review for Starfield, I had to go back and look at what the third trait I took was because I'd completely forgotten had that little of an impact across my playthrough. And I found it to be a similar story with the background. I chose to be an industrialist, basically having aspirations to be a titan of industry, so periodically through gameplay I could have a dialogue option around this, or another NPC would make a comment on it. This was mostly minor stuff, a new option that progressed things in a similar way, or just some additional dialogue that was a filler in between other quotes. Although there definitely was one interaction with one specific NPC where I was able to talk as an industrialist for several dialogue waves in a row, and it seemed like it genuinely allowed me to get a better outcome as a result of having that specific background during that quest. I was able to get both of the rewards as opposed to just having to choose one or the other, and this felt really cool. I really appreciated this moment, but unfortunately there was just one of these moments. All the other times industrialist came up, it was really minor. And honestly, when it came to my background, there were a couple of other points where I was talking to somebody and I was like, I feel like I should have a unique dialogue option here. Like as I was talking to an executive at a starship manufacturer. Much of the dialogue's corporate talk and talking about earnings or why he didn't report something stolen because it would affect earnings. I really felt like my background should have played a larger role there, but it actually played zero role. And for backgrounds overall, it seems like the starting skills you get with them are going to have a far larger impact on gameplay than dialogue or unique options for the background itself. Because skills in Starfield are incredibly important, and they're going to define your character in a far larger way compared to past Bethesda games. Something they did with Starfield is they locked a variety of abilities behind skills. Want to use a jetpack like that one you have on your back right now? Well, to actually fly around in this thing, you need to unlock the skill first. Do you want the ability to sneak and do sneak attacks? Yeah, you're going to need the skill first. And with some, like piloting more powerful ships, this means going down the skill tree to the later ranks of that skill. And to do this, you first need to complete the challenge associated with the skill, which in this case means taking out 15 enemy ships. That's not something you could just quickly do. It's really going to take time to get into the depths of the skill tree, and Starfield makes the choices you make here far more important compared to past games. I think a lot of people are going to be very surprised and almost have a bit of a shock when they jump into Starfield with how much they can't do right off the bat until they have the appropriate skills. Skills can be powerful and give you new abilities, but to get some of the best things, you will need to devote quite a bit of time to them, and I really like this. It felt like you were genuinely growing into your character over time and in a more meaningful way, because you were actually doing these things and then getting better at them. But Starfield is of course a space game, and that becomes a huge part of the gameplay in both positive and negative ways. Space combat and flying around overall was just fine. Starfield is definitely not a space sim. I mean, even my own flight stick didn't actually work with the game, which was a bit disappointing, but there's enough going on with space combat to make it so it's interesting and it has some depth overall. You can genuinely try to outmaneuver enemy ships, and this does work, at least to some degree. As well, shipbuilding is going to be very approachable and fun, as long as you actually have the credits to be able to do it, and you can make all kinds of interesting and wacky spacecraft, or even steal some, which is mostly what I did. And the shipbuilder here is very approachable. I found it very easy to just jump into, and you can even just mess around with it early on, even if you can't afford to build things yet. It's one of those things where it's like, is Starfield going to set new standards for space flight in video games? No. But for a giant open world RPG, what they managed to do with spaceship building as well as space flying and combat is genuinely impressive. But of course, exploration is also a huge part of Starfield. During your time, you're going to dart around the galaxy, and along the way, you'll encounter many ships and many people. There's an overhauled random encounter system for the game, so oftentimes, even if you land on a random planet, you'll have something around you. Some sporadically placed structure, even another space spaceship may land near you right after you land. So you would have a procedurally generated world, but some kind of handcrafted piece of content nearby to explore or experience. And for me, this was just okay. Things on this front definitely started to get pretty repetitive pretty quickly, just because of how systemic it was. Like almost every time you land on a planet, within 30 seconds, another ship is also going to land. The first couple of times, this was really cool. You would step back and be like, oh my god, somebody else is also landing? That's wild. But after the 50th time of landing on a planet, because naturally you're going to do that a ton in this game, and then like clockwork, there's another ship landing nearby, it's just like, okay, obviously this is an automated system, and it just starts to lose that appeal. The vast majority of the time, you're going to have other enemies land on the planet with you, so you could fight them or even try and take their ship, but there's some other neutral or passive interactions you could have as well, like helping somebody out on their ship, and you could technically steal those spaceships too if you want to. And some of the play structures had a similar feeling. They were clearly handmade, but also felt very generic and just not that memorable. Starfield has some really fun quest content, but it was very obvious when you're doing a random encounter on a planet as opposed to a handcrafted quest. Although conversely, the random space encounters were one of my favorite parts of this game. These were really fun and really unique. After grav jumping into a new system, there was a chance a ship would stop you. I ran into all kinds of things here. You could run into a dogfight between opposing factions, a now abandoned casino spaceship, or even a tour group going around with a bunch of tourists that wanted to ask questions to get the local captain's viewpoint. These genuinely made space travel feel fun, and a lot of times you'd just be doing some other quest, jump to a different system, and then all of a sudden get sidetracked by some interesting random encounter. These were super refreshing, and it genuinely made me want to adventure around more. Even if it was aimless, you would occasionally stumble upon something cool or fun. Although unfortunately in Starfield, some things you can't find. In Starfield, you're able to discover landing spots on various planets, but you can also just land anywhere you want on a planet. You could literally pick whatever spot you want yourself. I tried landing on Earth right near New York City to see what could be there. Obviously, Earth is mostly desolate in Starfield. I won't spoil why, but there's a lore reason for that and it makes sense. Unfortunately, as I was running around New York City, or where New York City was, I couldn't find anything, because it seems like to actually get unique content like this in Starfield, you first must discover the landing spot. You can't just run into it naturally, which I unfortunately discovered after spending way too much time running around vacant planets looking for things. But honestly, that isn't even that big of an issue. You probably don't want to be running around aimlessly on planets. It isn't all that much fun. What's a bit of a bigger issue here is Starfield has a lot of loading associated with its spaceflight and going from planet to planet. You will constantly be going back and forth from space to land, and then oftentimes a different land over and over. Every time you do this, there is a loading screen. Thankfully, you could bypass a decent chunk of these by just fast traveling around to the exact place you need to go. But Starfield, you're going to be staring at loading screens fairly often. And there's a ton of running. There's no land vehicles in Starfield, and a lot of times your ship won't land exactly where you need to be. So you may have a several 100-meter run to your destination right after you land. You spend a ton of time in this game just going from point A to point B, particularly while you're searching for the artifacts, and it definitely felt like planetary exploration would have been far more enjoyable if there was a faster method of transit on planets. But when it comes to combat, this was another thing to really blow me away with Starfield. There's going to be a ton of new mechanics implemented to make combat feel really good. Weapon hits felt incredibly satisfying and like they genuinely had weight to them. As you would hit an enemy, they would flinch back or even stumble from the hit. But there's also new visual effects and sounds associated with incoming fire to make them genuinely feel dangerous. Starfield implements this new downed enemy mechanic where you could have an enemy fall on the floor and basically be in a down state if you deal enough damage to them, and I believe other enemies can even revive them while they're like this, so you have to make sure you finish them off. But enemies can also blind fire from behind cover, or if things get too intense, enemies will run away from you, which is at points just hilarious, especially when it's a quest NPC sprinting away at full speed. There's going to be a huge variety of weapons here, ranging from insane spacer tech to just a good old shotgun that you could buy right now in real life. And although Starfield unfortunately still uses those cut to black scopes, just like in Fallout 4, the weapon designs as well as the weapon feel overall was phenomenal. Animations also got a huge upgrade. A lot of the weapon animations were really good, and something I was a huge fan of on the double barrel shotgun, there is a different animation for reloading both shells to just reloading one shell. And on top of this, there's going to be a rare, epic, and legendary weapon system, where you could basically have multiple effects on a weapon. This is one of those things that just kind of there in the background. You'll stumble upon these types of weapons all across the game, from containers or enemies, and it's a really fun and nice twist up. Sometimes you'll just get a surprisingly OP combination that that melts enemies as you use it. And then there is everything else. This is the aspect of Starfield I didn't dive as deeply into. I spent most of my time questing, but still spent a good few hours on all of the other things. Because Starfield does have a ton of other systems at play. Weapon crafting, outpost building, ship combat, and even just aimless exploration of different systems. And surprisingly enough, Bethesda did a pretty bad job at explaining most of these. Like outpost building had almost no tutorials associated with it from what I can tell. There is a help menu from the main menu that does have valuable information on all of these systems, as crafting an outpost building in Starfield will require 4 distinct things. There are raw resources like iron or aluminum, but then also a new manufactured resource like zero wire or a comm relay. Manufactured resources are a combination of raw resources, and these can be crafted at a new industrial workbench, or they could be just found while you're adventuring or bought from vendors. So it's almost like there's 2 tiers of junk now. You have raw junk, but then also manufactured junk. And this alone gets pretty confusing just because of how many things there are. There's going to be a ton of planets and tons of resources, and it's honestly hard to keep track of which resources you actually need. In Fallout 4, it's pretty easy. You could just be like, okay, yes, I always am going to want adhesive. I'll always loot adhesive when I find it. Starfield has a lot more than that. Like, even just here's an example. These are all of the resources I recently used. This isn't even a comprehensive list, just the ones I went out and bought to specifically craft something with them. And manufactured resources are going to be quite heavy. Sometimes you'll have several pounds of carry weight for just one junk item. So a lot of times as I'm playing the game, I don't really know if I need that thing necessarily, so I just didn't really loot these that often. I would just go to buy them as I needed them. You are able to tag missing resources while you're crafting to make them easier to find, but for some reason this tags everything you need to craft something, not just what you don't have enough of. And honestly, if it was just this, it would probably be okay, but this will really only get you into the introductory level of crafting. Because even beyond just the manufactured and raw resources, lots of items in Starfield or even mods for your weapons are going to be locked behind research, which is going to require not only more specific resources that you will need to find, but also most of the research is locked behind a skill, and oftentimes level 2, 3, or 4 of a skill, which means you're going to have to beat the challenge associated with that level of the skill first. And once you do all of that, find the resources, unlock the perk, research the mods, you're finally able to add some slug shells to your shotgun. But oh wait, that random NPC just dropped a different shotgun that does more damage anyway. I unironically probably spent 4 hours the other day just trying to get to the point where I could use slug shells with one of my shotguns. I have a shotgun build and I wanted to snipe people, and it felt like way too much of a time commitment and way too convoluted for what it was. And pretty much all of this is going to apply in exactly the same way to outpost building. On my first attempt, I sat down to try and find the right resources and really build up a base. But after an hour or two, all I had was a couple of empty hams and some power generation. I couldn't even invite anyone to my outpost to work because I didn't have a crew module yet. And crafting/outpost building are one of those things that I really feel like is a double-edged sword in Starfield. These are systems with a ton of depth, and it's likely going to be great for replayability over the long haul. But at the same time, sometimes these systems are just so daunting to dive into in the early game that it just turns you off of them completely. Like, there's numerous occasions where I wanted to really try and build an outpost because that seems like a really fun part of the game to me, but it was never really explained. So you're just reading through menus and trying to figure out what you actually need, and it gets very overwhelming very quickly. And overall, I would say these new systems definitely have a much larger time investment compared to past games, while at the same time having less tutorials compared to past games. Over time, it'll be fine. Players will learn this and there'll be tons of guides online, but on launch, I think a lot of players are going to feel overwhelmed by the crafting and manufacturing systems in Starfield. But something that absolutely did blow me away with Starfield was the visuals. Time and time again, while I was playing this game, I just had to stop to take it all in. One of the best examples of this was character faces. I'm not sure I've ever seen so much muscle movement with this much depth in a video game. It truly felt like you could see the emotion in characters' faces as you did quests with them. And of course, beyond that, some of the environments are just simply stunning. My first time landing on Neon, I was completely blown away. Like, I just really stopped to look at the city for a few minutes. As well as, of course, Starfield's going to have a ton of cosmic visuals, many of these being associated with the main story and finding the artifacts. And even though I had to find a ton of artifacts, I got to see these a bunch of times, it never got old. It always did feel special and like a moment in the game that was impactful. And some of the visuals, even on random planets, were equally as stunning. Starfield does not feature ray tracing, but it is still a very good looking game, and that was definitely one of the biggest upgrades I noticed compared to past Bethesda games. The visuals and sounds are just on a different level here. Although, expanding on that on the topic topic of performance and bugs, it wasn't horrible, but it also wasn't great. I played Starfield on a very high-end system. The game here was completely maxed out and I was playing at 4K resolution. Although unfortunately, at the time of recording this review, Starfield only supports FSR2, which means that for a significant chunk, like probably over 25% of my time in Starfield, I had under 60 FPS. The day one patch, which came out a couple of days ago for reviewers, definitely helped this somewhat. I got a small bump in FPS, but even just here, as I walk around New Atlantis or even Aquila City, I am under 60 FPS. And at points in Aquila City, I am in the low 50s for FPS. It's not like this would go way higher on a desolate planet. Even on some desolate planets, I was rarely crossing 80 FPS. I was definitely comfortably in the 70s to 80s, but it wasn't like I was pushing over 100 all of a sudden. I don't think I ever really saw over 100 FPS in this game. And one thing Bethesda deserves a ton of credit for here is this didn't actually feel that bad. Starfield is a very stable game. I never had any stutters, like literally not one stutter while playing Starfield. And though my FPS was a bit lower than I'm used to, I typically play games at or above 100 FPS. Since things were so stable, it didn't really bother me all that much. I honestly didn't even notice it that often. But where it becomes a bit frustrating is it really seems like this is unnecessary. Starfield is an AMD sponsored game, and for some reason Bethesda decided to not include DLSS of any kind with Starfield, this being the NVIDIA supported upscaler. One of the execs at AMD came out a couple of days ago and said Bethesda could have added DLSS to the game, but I guess they just decided not to. If Starfield had DLSS 3, I probably would never be dropping under 60 FPS, but for some reason they didn't, so here we are. So it's one of those things where it's disappointing that even with pretty much the best PC money could buy right now, I still wasn't able to get a consistent 60 FPS with this game maxed out, but thankfully in real gameplay terms, this didn't actually feel that bad. Starfield was very stable of a game, and just overall, when it comes to bugs, I had no stutters, no lag, and really no visual bugs whatsoever. There are definitely some bugs, like I saw some people saying Starfield has 0 bugs. I definitely noticed a couple of odd things from time to time, but the vast majority of the time, the bugs were just funny and super minor. Except for one. I did get one genuine bug when playing Starfield. During a quest, an NPC was unable to talk to me, and it blocked quest progression completely. I'm sure this would have been resolved if I just reloaded an earlier quick save, but I'm really dumb and instead decided to go do another quest. I figured this would resolve itself as I fast traveled back, except it didn't. So I had to use console commands to progress that quest, and if I didn't, I likely would not have been able to complete the Freestar Collective quest line. And this bug did come after the day one patch, so it's not like it was something that was patched out and I'm just reporting on it anyway. And on the front of crashes, I got 5 crashes in total while playing Starfield, and all of those crashes occurred before the day one patch. At the same time, the vast majority of my playtime was before the day one patch, so that could be a factor. But even still, 5 crashes in like 50 to 60 hours isn't really that bad. 1 crash every 10 hours for a Bethesda game is pretty good. Although one crash did occur literally as the credits were rolling, right as I beat the game for the first time, which is kind of hilarious. Because of where the quick save was, I had to run back and do the ending of the game a second time. But honestly, on this front, I don't have anything else to say. Starfield as it exists right now may have less bugs than Skyrim as it exists right now. This is legitimately the least buggy Bethesda Game Studios launch I have ever experienced. And if not for that one quest blocking issue, I would have almost nothing negative to say on this front. Overall for me, Starfield is a really good game. This is Bethesda Game Studios at a scale we simply have never seen before. And to do all of that with a near bug-free release is just something spectacular. But at the same time, it didn't really push those familiar Bethesda formulas forward. If you're hoping for a far greater degree of NPC reactivity or far more choice in quests, for me at least, I didn't notice that with Starfield. But thankfully, I think for a lot of people out there, it's not really gonna matter. There's such a ridiculous amount of content in this game that I bet many of you watching right now will have your first playthrough be several hundred hours in length. And even though some of these systems were confusing or tedious at points, there's so much else to do in Starfield that it really didn't even bother me. And I truly believe this has the potential to be the most modded Bethesda game ever, which I think they know. Starfield released with 2 skin packs, adding in a total of 7 new skins to the game, but for some odd reason, every single weapon and armor piece in Starfield has a skin option associated with it. As of right now, there are only 2 weapons in the game that technically support skins, but every weapon in the game has a skin option. Something tells me they're going to be selling us a lot more skins going forward.
New Atlantis sure is.
I will not aid you in this. You and I have things to discuss.